10 years ago, Ligue wasn't very good. So much so that some called it a farmers' league. But today, that's different. And so I'm joined by Jon Mackenzie and Alex Barker to find out when that changed and how. Alex, let's start with you. We've just said 10 years ago Ligue wasn't great, but what did that actually look like in practice?
Well, I think to understand that we should look at what a good league looks like. And I think both for massive nerds like myself and casual fans, like yourself, that looks like fun managers with fun, different tactical styles, clashing against each other, making interesting matches, and driving up the standard of the league. And 10 years ago, we have the Premier League as an example. Now, it's not the case across the league. We've still got the likes of Nigel Pearson and Alan Pardew near the bottom of the table. But we can see near the top, you have Mauricio Pochettino at Tottenham. He's instituting like high pressing, and at the time, it's very modern football. And below that as well, you have Roberto Martinez at Everton, and Ronald Koeman getting a lot of success with Southampton. A manager coming in with a different style and driving up the quality of the Premier League. It's not really the case for France. All but one of the managers in France are French. It's quite an entertaining graph to look at compared to the Premier League. The only manager there who isn't French is Claudio Ranieri at Monaco.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that Monaco at this point are trying to break the PSG monopoly. They're spending a lot of money. They've got a really good team coming through, and the manager that they choose to do that with is Claudio Ranieri, who is, I think, quite a conservative option for a foreign manager anyway.
It is worth saying as well, okay, a lot of the managers here are French. It's not to say they're all bad. Some of these managers go on to do pretty interesting things. Claude Puel at Nice, he goes on to manage Leicester to moderate success. Christophe Galtier at Saint-Etienne ends up winning Ligue 1 with Lille in 2021. But it is worth saying that a lot of these managers aren't near the top of the game in 2014-15, and they're nowhere near the top of the game now. We're going to have a little game with you, Joe. See if you can guess where these managers are today. Let's start with Antoine Kombari. A bonus point if you can tell me where he was before at Lens and where he is today.
I can play this game.
I have no clue either.
What's his name again?
Antoine Kombari.
Is it Real Madrid, Alex?
No. He was at PSG just when the Qataris took over, and he's now at Nantes, still in Ligue 1. There's some others though who aren't in France anymore. Let's go with Willy Sagnol. Now, you should have actually heard of him recently. Do you know where he is now?
No, I recognize the name though. Where is he?
He is the manager of Georgia, who did decently well at the Euros. Okay. Do you want to try Christophe Galtier? He won the league with Lille. Might be, he won the league. Maybe he's somewhere impressive.
I remember Christophe Galtier. Is he in America?
No, he's in Qatar. Oh. Yeah, so the broad picture is, while there are some managers here that are interesting, Ligue 1, in terms of tactical diversity, is far off the Premier League, I think the other leagues in Europe too.
Well, thanks for making me play a game that I couldn't possibly win. You're never invited back. Jon, let's talk about PSG as well, because by this point, QSI had already taken over. You mentioned them as a monopoly before. Was this helping or hindering French football, otherwise known as the Farmers' League?
Yeah, so QSI, the Qatar Sports Investment, they buy PSG around 2011 and they start immediately pumping money into the club. And I think these things can go one of two ways. You can be a net positive, you can be a net negative. And I think at this point in time, PSG actually end up being a net negative because a lot of the potential positives they could have don't actually come through. So the first thing we've already mentioned, they make the league into a monopoly. So it becomes very unlikely that any other club can actually break that monopoly. We do have a couple of examples. So teams like Monaco manage it, Lille manage it as well. But for the most part, we're talking about a league where the winner is almost always determined before the season starts. On top of that, we've talked about them pumping a lot of money into the league, and you would think, well, that should be quite good, right? You would get a trickle-down effect if PSG is spending a lot of money in transfers, for example. But actually, if we have a look at the data behind this, we can see, yes, QSI spend a lot of money in these first 5 seasons after they own the club. They only dropped below 100 million in transfer spend for one season. But actually, if we break that down in terms of how much of that money is going to other Ligue 1 clubs, it's very much not translating into that trickle-down economic effect. So never once breaking the 50 million mark in that first 5 seasons.
So while there's a lot of money going into PSG, it's almost immediatally going out to clubs in different leagues.
It's migrating out, which is the big problem of French football. It's almost always the value ends up moving outside of France.
Yeah.
By point of contrast, it's worth maybe talking about Manchester City, who, if we look at their transfers, as soon as Sheikh Mansour has taken over at the club, very much the opposite effect is happening there, where they're buying from the Premier League. So you are actually getting that trickle-down effect. And then I think the final thing we should talk about is the fact that in Ligue 1 at this time, there's only 2 guaranteed Champions League spots with a third spot where you go into a qualification round. The problem is that because PSG are taking up one of the guaranteed spots, it means there's only 1 guaranteed spot available. And that means that there's no club below them who can actually sustainably finish in that second place and get the benefit of the Champions League investment as well. So I would say at this point in time, PSG probably a net negative. And on the top of that, I would say PSG don't actually perform particularly well in Europe over this time period as well, because I think they have when QSI take over, they're in the Europa League. They only managed to get to the group stages of that, and then it's 4 quarterfinals in the Champions League in a row. So they're not even giving you the benefit of maybe bumping up the coefficient points, which, I think is, again, another reason why the league is being held back by them.
Hey, Alex, can you explain what Jon is talking about with coefficient points?
Yes, so the further your teams, I'm saying your as if you're a league, the Premier League for example, or Ligue 1 in this case, the further your teams go in Europe, the more UEFA coefficient points you obtain. And the more UEFA coefficient points you obtain, the more likely UEFA are to rank you ahead of other leagues. And the further ahead of other leagues you are, the more Champions League spots and European spots you're going to have in your league. So for example, up until 2017-18, the Premier League has 3 automatic Champions League spots and 1 qualification spot. It's ranked as one of the best leagues in Europe. But Ligue 1, as Jon mentioned, only has 2 automatic Champions League spots and 1 qualification spot. And in terms of coefficient points for France, throughout the 2010s, they're consistently behind the top 5 league average. And it is even worth pointing out that for the early part of this period, I think up until 2014-15, France aren't even considered a top 5 league in UEFA's rankings because they've just done so poorly in Europe. It's actually Portugal who finished ahead of them, and PSG's moderate success getting to the quarterfinals helps France just squeeze into the top 5. But it is worth looking at the other French teams and how they've been getting on in Europe, because it is a really important point. The fewer teams you have in Europe, of course, the fewer UEFA coefficient points you're going to be able to get. Simple maths. And I think there's a really big consequence to what Jon was talking about of having a team swallow up 1 automatic spot like PSG every single year and have the likes of Marseille, Lyon, Lille, Monaco and Nice and later Rennes all fighting over those 2 remaining spots. Now, of course, if you don't like Ligue 1, you think it's just not a good league and the teams aren't good, you might look at this and say, well, that's all well and good, but Lyon, Lille, Monaco, 3 years in a row, they don't even qualify for the group stages in this qualification spot. So you might say it's their fault. They've had the opportunity, Lyon and Monaco and Lille, to get into the group stages. They haven't. That's just representative of them not being good teams, not worthy of France having the extra Champions League spot. But let's look at Serie A in this period, because Serie A is another league, the only other one of the top 5 leagues, if you like, who are in the same position as Ligue 1. So 2 automatic Champions League spots, 1 qualification spot. Remember that. And Serie A, despite being a league which I don't think has had as many accusations of being a farmers' league, let's say, not being as high quality like Ligue 1 has, before 2018-19, actually that's kind of similar to Ligue 1. You see Napoli, Lazio and Roma 3 years in a row, same as France, not even qualifying for the group stages. What the big thing that happens though in 2018-19 is Serie A, the Bundesliga, La Liga and the Premier League, we enter our window of familiarity here. These 4 leagues get 4 automatic Champions League spots, no qualification spots, while Ligue 1 is still left on just 2 plus 1 qualification spot. And I'm not going to say this is direct link to what I'm about to say, but let's explore something here. Inter Milan and a team to dethrone Juventus. It's worth mentioning Juventus, like PSG, are dominating the league, much in the same way PSG are with Ligue 1, taking up 1 of the automatic spots. When Serie A gets 4 spots, Inter Milan, the 4th place team 2 seasons in a row in the first 2 seasons. And of course, they go on to dethrone Juventus in 2021. They're the team to end the dynasty and they win under Antonio Conte. And it's worth thinking, would they have been able to do that if Serie A didn't get the extra Champions League spots and Inter Milan didn't bring in the Champions League revenue that, as Jon pointed out, is incredibly important? And would they have been able to buy Romelu Lukaku, Achraf Hakimi? Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe Inter Milan would have instead looked more like one of Ligue 1's runner-up teams and been a bit more up and down. We can have a look at that with Marseille, for example. Marseille some people would argue Ligue 1's biggest club. They are, at the time of recording, the only ones who have actually won a Champions League, right? But they're very much up and down throughout the 2010s. They're never posing a challenge to PSG. You know, again, it's worth exploring what would this league look like if fourth place in these periods looked like Champions League spots and they were able to bring in that Champions League revenue. Maybe they wouldn't have dropped down to 13th in the season afterwards. The one team who does almost do this is Monaco. They get promoted in 2013, have a very rich owner, spend 100 million euros a year, and it culminates in them dethroning PSG. They win it in 2016-17. And they finished second the year after. At this point, you might think, great, this is the time they can become the best of the rest. They can become the Dortmund to the Bayern, and they fall down to 17th. And we'll quickly explore the reason why. It's not much guessing here. Do you remember the Monaco team, the great Monaco team of 2016-17? Mm-hmm. Do you remember what happened to all of the players?
They all left.
They did indeed all leave. Kylian Mbappe, Bernardo Silva going, Thomas Lemar and Fabinho in the 2 seasons after they win the league. Now, in fairness, Ligue 1 is a bit of a selling league. Maybe this was bound to happen. They just made an incredible achievement. They also reached the semi-finals of the Champions League, it's worth saying. But it's worth looking at the teams they sold players to, Man City, Chelsea, for example, Liverpool, compared to the teams they buy players from. Keita Balde from Lazio, you've got Alexander Golovin from CSK Moscow. It's like their record fees. It's just a significant drop-off, and they're not able to build a team that can continue competing at the top of Ligue 1 and consolidate their position in the Champions League spaces. Now, it's worth saying Monaco are a bit of a unique case in France, maybe another reason why they aren't able to do this. Here's a quote from their vice president. This is after the season where Thierry Henry almost gets them relegated and their big drop-off. Oleg Petrov, he says, I think the essence of the club is not going to change because the club has to sell and buy players and cannot count on millions of fans to generate revenue. What he's talking about is Monaco is not a very well supported club. Here's a picture of their recent game against Strasbourg. This is near the end of the season, a big game, and this is the type of attendance Monaco are used to. So what the case of Monaco is, which maybe adds to this, is they just haven't got the fan base to help them sustain revenue near the top of the table.
Well, of course, half of their fans live on boats and aren't there for half the year.
Yeah, that might be a big reason why.
Yacht people. So, John, there's not much money going into Liga from the Champions League, and we know that while PSG are spending big, most of it, with the exception maybe of the Kylian Mbappe money, is going outside of the league. So where does this leave Liga or the rest of Liga from a financial perspective?
Well, I think a really good way of being able to determine the financial health of a league is how much the teams in that league can spend money on transfers, for example. So if we actually look at the transfer spend and we go back to the beginning point of our story, so 2015-16 season, we can see that Ligue 1 is solidly at the bottom of the top 5 leagues when it comes to transfer expenditure. There's not a lot of money around, so you can't spend a lot of money on players. Now, the Kylian Mbappe sale is kind of interesting because it's the first example we have of PSG actually injecting a lot of money into the league. Interestingly, that leads to the league itself being able to spend more money. So we already see a bit of a jump up here where the sale of a player actually leads to that trickle-down effect that we're talking about actually happening. The other point of interest in this data set is COVID year, where everyone takes a bit of a hit because there's uncertainty about how financially sustainable football can be. But actually coming out of that COVID period, I think we can see that Ligue 1 is able to recover much better than a lot of the other leagues around this time. So by the time we get to 23-24 season, we can see that Ligue 1 actually spends more than 3 of the other leagues, with the exception of the Premier League. So there's money in the league that they can actually spend. They do drop down the following season to 3rd place, but I think it's worth saying here that Serie A spends more money. But if you compare the net spends for both of these leagues, Ligue 1 at 3rd place is still sustainable. With Serie A, they make a big loss to be able to be 2nd place when it comes to the transfer window. So I think what this tells us is that actually it's much easier for Ligue 1 to be financially sustainable out of this COVID period.
And how are they able to still be making more money than they're spending if their transfer expenditure is going up by this much?
Well, I think that brings us to one of the real strengths of French football. It's the ability of the clubs within it to actually generate value by developing players.
Yeah, a good example of that is Lyon, because in the late 2000s, they're kind of like a Serie A club. They're spending very heavily. They end up making quite a lot of losses. And in the early 2010s, they pivot and they start prioritising their academy under Jean-Michel Aulas. They start paying, I think it's 7 million euros a year into their academy, and like spending far less on actual player transfers. And Aulas says we're going to become a team that's much more reliant in terms of like making money on selling academy products than bringing players in. And this is actually a very clever idea in this time, because UEFA FFP comes in, financial fair play, which designates money spent on academy football and women's football. It doesn't count towards your costs in the red zone, right? So Lyon and other French teams as well, they're not the only team to invest in their academy during this time. They're able to pump money in and not show up in the red in UEFA FFP and end up making a lot of money further down the line.
And I think this shows up in the financial numbers, because if you actually look at Lyon's financial accounts from 2014, they actually do some projections as to how much the value of their squad is coming from academy players. So it starts in 2012 with them saying 46% of their squad value is coming from academy players. The following season, that jumps up to 70% of their squad value is coming from academy players. By the time they reached June 2014, 85% of the value of their squad is academy players. So this is players who they've not had to spend money on, which I think it just shows the difference between Ligue 1 and the other leagues, right? The other leagues are generating value through buying players and hoping that those players perform well, whereas this is coming from basically free money. It's like we take the good players when they're young, we develop them, then they accrue value, we sell them, and then we make money in that way.
It's the money tree, Jon.
It's the money tree.
It is the money tree, Jon. But there are still some glaring issues, right?
Yeah, I think financially, Ligue 1 is in a really good place, but there's one area where they are actually quite deficient and have been for a while.
The money tree?
Well, it's partly to do with the money tree, but it's TV revenues. Because TV revenues, as we know, are a big reason why, for example, the Premier League is such a successful product. So this is a chart from Deloitte which shows you the amount of revenue that is generated by each league through TV broadcasting rights. And we can see the Premier League absolutely hands and away above everyone else. The problem for France is that they're at the bottom of this money tree.
It does kind of look like a tree.
Yeah, sure. But the big thing for me here is that TV broadcasting is just the final piece of the financial puzzle, right? Because what you're doing essentially is selling TV entertainment. In order to do that, you have to have a product that is entertaining. The Premier League has been able to do that by being ahead of the curve on everything. So they have the most entertaining product. They can charge the most for people to watch it. The issue with France, I guess, is that for the longest time, they haven't had an entertaining product. And so this is the final piece of the puzzle. I think they've solved so many other problems financially that they're in a good position to actually start breaking into this TV broadcasting market. So I think the real test of how well Ligue 1 is doing going forward is going to be whether or not they can leverage this, the product that they've created, as a TV entertainment entity and actually generate money from that. And so in a few years' time, we may see them being able to actually generate more TV revenue as a result of this.
Okay, so I mean, how are they making the product more attractive, Alex?
Well, Joe, if you remember right at the start, we showed that chart where 95% of the managers in France were French, and a lot of them you hadn't heard of and will never hear of them again. It's a very different picture now. Only 55% of the managers in France are French, and that's at the start of this season. There's been a few replacements. Pierre Sarge at Lyon's been replaced by Paulo Fonseca, for example. It's a bit more of a tactically diverse league, and I think that's down to two things that kind of come into each other. First of all, Ligue 1 clubs are maybe a bit less insular than they were 10 years ago. They're not just going for French managers, right, and what they know, but also they're a bit more attractive to foreign coaches. And I think a good example to explore here would be Liam Rossigny at Strasbourg. Rossigny's stock is a lot higher than it was a year ago. He's had a lot of success in France. Bit of context, Strasbourg team he's managing, obviously they're owned by Chelsea, but even prior to this season, they were a team that's flirted more with relegation than the European spots. They're kind of a mid-table team, generally played long ball football. That's the image, that's the team he was coming into. Now, he has a very different vision of how he wants to play his football. It's a lot more possession-based. And one of his key principles is, just for simplicity, think of Roberto De Zerbi. Wants to bait opponents forward, build through the press, not go long too often, and try and play through it. Very De Zerbi-esque. And there's three circumstances in Ligue 1 that have enabled him to do that. And further than that, three circumstances in Ligue 1 that I think are an example of why managers like Rossigny will continue to move to France. So the first one is it's just a bit less cutthroat than the Premier League, right? The Premier League, I think, is recognised as the best league in the world. The standard of manager there is incredibly high. We've seen lots of managers do well abroad and struggle in the Premier League. Ligue 1 is not on that level yet. As we've seen, it's improved, obviously, but maybe there's a bit more space to get a bit of success. So for Rossigny, I think what that looks like in Ligue 1 is the press he comes up against, they're not always super tight. Like there's sometimes a bit more space, let's say, just to visualise it, that his team can exploit. Now, the second circumstance in Ligue 1, which is enabling managers like Rossigny to thrive, is it's a very young league. Now, Strasbourg, obviously a hyper-extreme example of this. They're by far the youngest team in Europe, but Ligue 1 is the youngest league in Europe as well. So I think this is applicable to other teams too. And having a young group of players makes it generally easier to implement your tactical ideas. So just one example of this, just one pattern I saw Strasbourg very quickly implement was counter movements, pulling one opposition player one way and exploiting the space. So this is something they were doing a couple of months in, basically, where Strasbourg building out for the back, Nanasi might drop in, he'll receive the ball, he's taking this player with him, he leaves the ball off to a midfielder, and Barso, he'll know it straight away, he's putting the ball straight in behind this space for Omega to run into, and Strasbourg can go forward. So Rossignol was able to implement ideas like this very quickly. Now, the third circumstance why Rossignol's done well, and again, why managers like him, I think will continue to move to France and get success, is it's not just these players are young and have small minds and are ready to get into your tactical ideas. They're also very good players. The Ligue 1 has become a hotbed of talent, we've said this, and that enables quite a lot of flexibility in the way you want to play. So again, let's visualise this for Strasbourg. You have two centre-backs here in Sarr and Decore. These guys are pretty physical, but they're also very good on the ball, which means Rossignol's been able to play them very wide. That's enabled them to stretch opponents' presses a lot more, and again helps make it easier to play out from the back. And further forward you have players like Le Maréchal, who I think was there before Chelsea even took over Strasbourg, Bakwa and others who are very good in tight spaces, which means, let's say the opposition have a very good press, they're able to close you down. You have players who can get out of those tight spaces and go forward and again help you play out from the back and get forward. So the result of this is Strasbourg under Rossignol became very good at what he wanted to do. Here is a table. Now the long version of this is it's XG generated within 30 seconds of a short pass in the box. I'm aware I may have made your eyes glaze over, so I've attached a very lovely graph just to help it make it a bit easier.
I am looking at that.
I thought so. It's for you. It's just for you. It's how much XG and goals have been generated in doing this within 30 seconds. And Strasbourg are third in Ligue 1, behind Marseille under De Zerbi. No surprises there given what we've just spoken about, and PSG. So overall, Rossignol is a great example of a young manager coming to France, seeing his stock rise massively, implementing these ideas very quickly, and that's obviously down to him being a good coach, but the circumstances in Ligue 1 enabling him to thrive.
That's interesting. I mean, John, PSG have changed as well, it's fair to say, right? Not just some of these other teams.
Yeah, I think what's interesting with PSG is we started off talking about 10 years ago them being a net negative on the league. Given the context shift, I think we're now arriving at a point where you can argue that they're actually starting to have a net positive on the league in certain ways. One of those is that, as we've already touched on, PSG start spending money within the league itself. They make a bit of a pivot from being a Galacticos team to being a team that recognises that they actually exist in a league where there is a hotbed of talent, and they can bring that talent in, and you know that necessarily will benefit them. And I think what that starts doing then is sort of changing the status of the league from what was previously, I think, quite a migratory league. What we're seeing now is PSG creating an atmosphere where it's like the Ligue 1 is a league where people want to be, where young French players can believe, if I want to make a name for myself, I can do that at the club, the biggest club in my country. That's all adding to this concept of a product that you're offering that can result in maybe TV revenue further down the line. So just a couple of examples here. We've got Desiree Doué and Bradley Barcola, two players who've been brought into the club from Ligue 1. And on top of that, it's worth mentioning players like Dembele or Luca Hernandez, who were players who were playing elsewhere, who have now been able to be brought back into the club. Ousmane Dembele has been reinvented in this season. But again, it's this idea that PSG are a French club. French football has something to offer. And I think that all adds to this idea that French football actually is a sellable product. The other thing to say, I think, is that this season, PSG have become arguably the best team in Europe under Luis Enrique. I think that's a really interesting concept because I think there's a few things to say. I think previously, I would have characterised Luis Enrique as a sort of paint by numbers positional play coach, right? So you just sort of end up with quite rigid structures and the actual end product isn't that good or that successful. But we've seen a couple of things happening this season. I think the most interesting thing is we're seeing a sort of very modern, I would say, idea of positional play being used. So rather than having sort of strict positions for the players on the pitch, what we see is, and I like to use the language of, there's an analyst called Callum Saunders who talks about this. He talks about anchors and floaters. I thought you'd quite like the concept of floaters. Anchors and floaters. I would maybe add pinners into that as well. But what he means by anchors and floaters is there's certain non-negotiable positions that have to be filled. So your anchors might be the back three who will end up in a rest defence position, right? So these are the guys you want to make sure that you're not going to leave yourself exposed. So you want to make sure you've got three players in these positions. There's often a midfielder in front of them. And then we have the pinners. So this is going to be the guys who will probably be Barcola on one side and then Hakimi on the other. These are the guys who are creating the width, so dragging the opposition back line apart. And these are sort of very standard ideas within positional, like traditionally positional play. But what we're starting to see now then is the introduction of what Callum Saunders calls floaters, which is players who have a little bit more freedom to just move around. This midfield is incredible, I think, because you have Vitinha, Doué and João Neves. They can essentially just all rotate round and end up in any kind of iteration here. And because they're so similarly profiled, you have the ability to just shift your midfield focus. As long as you've got, generally speaking, one player deeper by these three anchor players, you then have the ability to actually move around so that oppositions are going to struggle to mark them.
A bit like when you and I play FIFA, John.
Yeah, I would describe you as a floater, definitely. And then we have the same principle up front as well. So we've got Ousmane Dembele, who traditionally has played in wide areas. He's now being used centrally by Luis Enrique. Kvaratskhelia has been brought in from Napoli. These are two players who can drop in between the lines. They can move either side of the pitch and can make things happen and interact with the midfielders as well. So in possession, super modern tactical ideas, which I think is really good for the league because it allows people to watch the product and say this is really entertaining football. But the other thing that he's done is the out of possession side of things as well. So this is just a chart showing PPDA on a rolling average through time. And what I think really stands out here is for Luis Enrique, he's making those numbers really low. That's what you generally want to do. The lower the number, the more intense your press is. Generally speaking, elite teams are able to control games without the ball as well as with the ball. And I think it's quite clear that Luis Enrique has got this team actually playing in a really, really tight way out of possession as well. The big question here then is Luis Enrique Ligue 1's Pep Guardiola or Jurgen Klopp? Because I think, again, coming back to the idea of a product, the Premier League really took off when there was that competition at the top of the league where you had really smart tactical coaches generating really good football. We talked a few weeks ago about the Big Six becoming generated from a Big One, a Big Two, a Big Four. You know, the more competition you have at the top of a league, the easier it is to sell that product. And I think by having a Pep Guardiola type figure or a Jurgen Klopp type figure who is going to generate this kind of competition, I think could be really good for them as well. So I think going forward, the big question is, can we start seeing this deepening of the competition at the top of the league? Ligue 1 has always been sort of held as a farmers' league because it's a monopoly league. If with more money going into the league, with better coaches going into the league, could we end up with a scenario where that monopoly of PSG is actually challenged and it generates a better product?
Well, is there anyone else in the league, Alex, that could provide competition? Doesn't seem so.
Well, potentially Marseille. Marseille are a bit different to Monaco, who have challenged PSG because they are, well, arguably one of the biggest clubs in Europe. They have an average attendance of about 63,000, which could rival like the top Premier League clubs, right? They've got the fan base to sustain themselves potentially like as a self-sufficient club near the top of the table. So if they can get their house in order and get near the top of the table, they probably have the biggest potential to stay there.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying as well, they've spent 100 million in the transfer windows for the last 3 seasons. So they are spending money. They've been able to attract Roberto De Zerbi, who's one of the best coaches in the world. So I guess everything is in place for them to be that club which actually really starts challenging at the top.
Okay, so I guess the final question is, do you think that Liga is now the second best league in Europe?
I think, as I said before, it comes down to me whether or not they manage to break the TV revenue market. If they can do that, they've created the product that is there. It's now on the French league to actually sell that product to the TV broadcasting companies. If they can do that, then they're well on their way to becoming the second best league in Europe.
What do you think?
I'd echo John's sentiment. I mean, I think Ligue 1 is on the positive direction. It's probably still the 5th best league, but to talk about what John's saying, making it a more interesting product, it's worth quickly mentioning the changes Ligue 1 is making, as well as getting extra Champions League spots. They cut down the league from 20 to 18 teams, improving the average quality of the sides you've got. They've got into a habit of giving teams in Europe a rest at weekends, again, potentially giving them a chance to go further in Europe. And in France, there are reports as well that they're potentially moving to a championship playoff to decide who wins Ligue 1. Now, if they execute that well, and then make Ligue 1 less of a one-team league, then suddenly it's potentially in a very good position, as John said, to become a better product and maybe eventually get to the second best league in Europe.
It's a farmers' league.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.